People are always telling me to investigate VRAM, and people always want me to take a look at the high-end 8000 series by Nvidia. But what happens when we mix the two together and get the last high-end 256MB graphics card? This right here is the Asus GeForce 8800 GT, the last truly high-end graphics card featuring 256MB of VRAM, as the ones that would later follow, namely the rebranded Sparkle 9800 GT, actually performed worse in most scenarios. Anyway, this card here is based on the G92 variant of the Tesla architecture, which was constructed on the 65nm node and clocks in at 600MHz. Released towards the end of 2007, it found itself triumphant over the competing AMD 2000 series cards until Terascale matured enough to actually overtake Nvidia when it came to price and performance with the 3000 and 4000 series. So this variant here was their attempt to retake the budget segment, offering essentially the same performance as the larger, much more expensive cards, while being available at their lowest price point in terms of the cards available. However, because of this, it wasn't released exactly as you'd expect it to be, with only 256MB of GDDR3, clocking in at 900MHz. It does support DirectX 10 and has a nice 125W TDP, meaning it's relatively cool for a high-end card. Given these impressive specifications, it was also not too expensive at $219 or £160. Today it's around £6 or the same as that in dollars, as they're not exactly rare cards and not really sought after either. But do keep in mind, I'm not really promoting this as a budget gaming card. Reviewers at the time praised its performance as the VRAM proved to not be as constraining as the card itself was, especially considering the card itself could be found for around $100 less than the 512MB variant of the 8800 GT. And given the common resolutions of the day, it wasn't around till the 1200p resolution where you actually saw performance disparity between the 256MB and 512MB variants of the card. And even so, it didn't exactly render the game unplayable on the lower tiered card, especially considering that you could actually up the settings on both cards and they were both decently impacted to the same playability levels. So it's not exactly like the cards showed that much difference, as the games really performed exactly the same regardless, unless you went too high in terms of what the actual card was demanded to do, in which case there are some outliers like Call of Duty 4, but only in the 2560 by 1600 resolution, so you can see why budget gamers found this quite a nice choice. It was concluded by most reviewers that the 512MB VRAM edition should be a sweet spot, but for saving $100 here or there, this was very little incentive for a budget gamer to get one of the higher spec 8800 GT cards with 512MB of VRAM, especially given how little performance was gained by moving up a level, and how much was lost by moving down to the dreadful 8600 GT, which can be seen in my very old review of it. So why don't we take this 8800 GT, the last true 256MB king of price to performance, and see how it fares 11 years after its initial release, with only 256MB of VRAM to game with in 2018. GTA 5 up first, which supports DirectX 10 and scales well from working from small amounts of VRAM to utilising as much as possible with its additional options. It felt pretty playable, but there were some frame drops, which dropped our average just below 30 FPS. These were mainly when driving and when in heavy action, as otherwise we saw our average hover just above 30 FPS, which was actually pretty smooth. However, the VRAM was virtually all used up, which may have increased the severity of these drops. But for a 10-year-old card, it's doing remarkably well even starting the game and giving us a borderline playable experience. And I will say it's quite comparable to the 8800 GT with either 512 or 1GB of VRAM. Fortnite still supports DirectX 10 graphics cards, so did actually decide to work from the moment that I clicked launch, with a solid 56 FPS on average, 1% lows down to 29 FPS, as well as 0.1% lows down to 12 FPS, the latter of which was mainly from the game loading in when we were dropping down. Once on the ground though, our frame rate was pretty stable regardless of what was happening. Although the game didn't look very pretty, our 256MB of frame buffer didn't exactly have much of an effect, as the power that the card lacks is mainly more limiting than the VRAM here. So most of the benchmarks you see relating to this card, whether it be the 1 gig, the half a gig, will all have similar performance to this, and some textures did overlap into our system RAM, but most system RAM nowadays is fast enough to cope with that little bit of deficit in terms of VRAM. Minecraft was one of our first real insights in how the RAM of the card may actually be a limiting factor, as we can see the 720p frame rates were more than playable. The game looked lovely and the GPU saw decent utilization given the nature of Minecraft and how it deals with GPUs considering it's primarily a CPU based game. However, when it came to flicking the switch to 1080p it wasn't as smooth, and the VRAM usage had actually gone up. But then again, so had the utilization of the card. So realistically, it's more of a case that the card didn't actually have the power in the first place to run the game at 1080p, so it's not so much the lack of VRAM, it's more the fact that the card just doesn't actually have the power to push this game at 1080p. So if you want to play this game, I'd probably recommend 720p on this card, regardless of the version you have and the frame buffer you have available. CSGO didn't seem to mind only having 256MB of VRAM available to it, even in its bloated state. However, it was safe to assume given the figures in the top left that it was overflowing to our system RAM. But given the fact that decently spec'd DDR3 RAM, yet alone DDR4, is so fast that it didn't exactly have much of an effect on our overall experience, aside from seeing maybe a worsening of frame drops that could occur when a lot was going on, leading to a playable average of 53 FPS, 1% lows of 35 FPS, and 0.1% lows of 33 FPS, which is very much in line with the other versions of this card. So once again, not so much a VRAM issue, so much as it is an issue with the card's lack of power itself. But then again, CSGO is so bloated nowadays that this card, it's surprising that it's coping as well as it is, and if you're a casual gamer it was way more than playable. And if you're a professional gamer, please do not go out and buy a 10-year-old graphics card with 256MB of VRAM to play this game professionally. And because this seems to stop every comment in the comments section, does it run Crysis? And it does remarkably well actually, with around 35 FPS on average, with a mixture of medium and high settings. So definitely not bad in terms of performance when we're looking at a game as intensive as Crysis. The game was originally benchmarked when the card was released, and as we can see the card worked about the same as it did back then. And the VRAM only really becomes an issue at higher resolutions, where it wasn't exactly playable even on the higher VRAM variants of the card. At least not smoothly, that is. Far Cry 3 was a similar story to that of Minecraft. 1080p in this case was a stuttering mess and the VRAM was full, but mainly due to the weakness of the card it couldn't be run, as no matter what 8800 GT variant you're using, you simply can't run the game on this card in these settings. So I decided to drop it down to something a bit more appropriate for a card of this age, like 720p, which saw the game become much more playable given that the card was fully utilised in every aspect. And our system RAM was once again being used as a pool for resources, which did lower our frame time slightly compared to other 8800 GT benchmarks I've seen. The game was very much playable, however, and it was pretty damn good considering the lack of VRAM on the card and the weakness the card actually has itself. Skyrim was a weird one. I tried 2 different sets of drivers on 2 different sets of PCs, and despite being set to the low preset, the game just couldn't run in 1080p, and it was just a static screen. And it's not like 720p was actually much better. I mean, sure we could move, but the game itself just wouldn't work. Attempting to run DDU and reinstall the drivers made absolutely no difference to the game's performance, and it was just all around abysmal on a card that should by all means be able to run the game in low settings. The card was even utilised as we can see in the top left, so it's strange that this is happening. And if anyone knows why, it'd be certainly interesting to find out why it's happening, and if it is a driver related bug like I think it seems to be. And of course, using DXCPL we forced DirectX 11 support, which sometimes works but most of the time fails pretty miserably, as the card has no idea what it should be doing. I mean, it's a DirectX 10 card and shouldn't be running DX11 titles. So for the likes of Prey, which actually started, we saw 5 FPS on average, which was mainly when we were looking down at our feet. The VRAM wasn't fully utilised and neither was the card itself, seeing 30% in the loading screen and a solid 0% in the game, so definitely not too good there. Emulation-wise, it's always good to see how these older cards fare in what is a continuously challenging task for most modern cards, and given that this was a £6 graphics card, it made sense to see if it turns out to be a good budget emulation card. I mean, firstly, its first weakness is that it doesn't have DX11 support or Vulkan support, so we have to use a custom fork of Dolphin in order to use the DX9 renderer, which performs best on a card like this. 480p Wind Waker was playable actually and surprised me. However, I decided to update the resolution to 720p and it worked equally as nice, which was a nice surprise indeed. In fact, the game ran virtually the exact same regardless of resolution, with 16 times anisotropic filtering, just to give the nice background details a bit of boost when it comes to looking at them. Moving on to Wii emulation, I decided to test Marycart Wii, which was actually surprising because it was faultless given the card's power and the fact we're using the DirectX 9 renderer, which can throw up issues in some games. It was very smooth and the VRAM usage hovered around 230 megabytes, so it wasn't exactly like we were using up all of our frame buffer, and it wasn't overtly necessary for these types of emulation games, as Wii games tend to be more dependent on raw CPU and GPU power rather than the VRAM available to them, but Marycart did in fact work very nicely. The same goes for Super Mario Bros. Wii, which saw a nice and smooth locked 50 FPS, with a couple of drops thrown in there. The DX9 renderer did of course cause issues on the world map and made everything seem to be having an earthquake. However, once you got into actual gameplay, this issue did not persist, which made for a nice little bit of emulation on the card. Newer titles than this though did struggle, and some of them just showed black screens or crashed immediately, so I'm not exactly going to recommend this as a budget emulation card, purely because it can't run most of those newer emulated titles. In FIFA 18, as I've had good results with it actually starting with DXCPL allowing it to run, however it just threw up a crap ton of errors, which meant that it didn't actually work. Not a fault of the card mind you, just a lack of the supported APIs. 3D Mark saw a pleasant score of 7027, placing it around 30% worse than an overclocked HD 4850, which is exactly where I'd expected it to be placed, so synthetically the VRAM didn't exactly have much of an effect there, essentially where the 8800 GTs find themselves considering the power they had available, but it also found itself to be much better than the 8600 GT, as expected. So in conclusion, once again, what have we taken from this? Well, mainly that the VRAM didn't actually have as much of an effect as I thought it would, and at the time it was quite a nice budget incentive, and it proves today that they were right, that the VRAM didn't actually affect it where you needed it to. But then again, the 8800 GT series nowadays is so cheap that if I was to recommend this as a budget retro gaming card, you can actually grab one of the better versions for not much more, so really it's a choice of whatever you find cheapest and whatever you want to buy. I mean, it's surprising that newer titles like Fortnite and GTA 5 were actually quite playable, especially considering the performance which was with even that small amount of VRAM. Really, today 2GB is what you should aim for on any card with around the power of an R9 285 or GTX 1050 Ti, but for older cards I'd imagine you'll see a similar story to this, where the card lacks the power before the actual VRAM becomes an issue, especially given the speed of modern RAM, provided you have a decent amount of it already available. But given the price of DDR4, then I'm going to say that's quite unlikely. I mean, some of you with DDR3 may actually have quite a bit of it lying around, but even so, the prices for that are still somewhat high compared to what they used to be. But if you buy used, you should be okay. I'm going to try and find a retro purpose for this 8800 GT, but realistically, I'm just surprised how well 256MB of VRAM held up today in 2018. I mean, it was using my RAM as an overflow, but still, the performance is admirable from such an old card, especially one that came out 11 years ago. Thank you very much for watching, good night. Plenty more videos are on the way, and something special on the way for 100,000 subscribers if we do ever hit that mark. So like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this, and I'll catch you guys in another tech video.